Attention! Today we invite you to dive into one of the most remarkable events of the Second World War, the Battle of Moscow, where nature itself became the main ally of the defenders of the capital, and the German war machine cracked for the first time under the pressure of the Russian frost. Before we begin, write in the comments where you are watching from and at what time you are listening to this story. It is important for us to know where and when our viewers learn about these incredible pages of history. So, let's begin. November 30th, 1941. German soldier Helmut Paulus sits in a trench just 30 kilometers from Moscow. He sees the towers of the Kremlin through binoculars. The Soviet capital is within reach, but his fingers no longer bend. The thermometer shows minus 42 degrees Celsius. Paulus tries to write something in his diary, but the pencil slips from his frozen hands. Nearby stands a tank, the pride of German industry, the Panzer III. But now it is just a metal coffin. The engine is dead, the oil has frozen, the tracks are stuck to the ground. This is not just cold. This is a catastrophe that no one in the German command had foreseen. Operation Typhoon, the final strike on Moscow that was supposed to end the war before Christmas, has turned into a nightmare. 1 million German soldiers of Army Group Center have literally frozen on the approaches to the Soviet capital. Let us go back a few months to understand how the greatest war machine in the world became helpless in the face of the Russian winter. June 1941. Operation Barbarossa unfolds with stunning success. The Wehrmacht advances deep into the Soviet Union at a speed of 50 kilometers per day. Guderian's tank columns sweep away everything in their path. Minsk falls in 6 days, Smolensk in a month, Kiev is surrounded, Leningrad is blockaded. Euphoria reigns in Hitler's headquarters. The Führer is already planning a victory parade on Red Square. The generals argue not about whether they will win, but about how many days it will take to capture Moscow. Halder, chief of the general staff, writes in his diary, "It would not be an exaggeration to say that the campaign against Russia has been won in 14 days. But there is one detail that everyone stubbornly ignores. Summer is ending, and the German army is not prepared for winter." The logistics services of the Wehrmacht made plans based on the assumption that the war would be over before the cold weather. Winter uniforms were not produced in sufficient quantities. Special oils for machinery, capable of withstanding extreme temperatures, were not ordered. Antifreeze was designed for minus 20, at most minus 25 degrees, an ordinary European winter. One of the German generals, Blumentritt, later recalled, "We studied Napoleon, but decided that we were smarter, that our technology and organization would allow us to win before winter. This was our fatal mistake." On October 2nd, 1941, Hitler orders the start of Operation Typhoon, the general offensive against Moscow. Nearly 2 million men, 1,800 tanks, and 14,000 artillery pieces are involved. It is the largest battle of World War II up to that moment. The first days of the offensive again bring success. Soviet armies are encircled near Vyazma and Bryansk. The Germans capture more than 500,000 prisoners. The road to Moscow seems open, but on October 7th, the rains begin. The Russian autumn turns roads into rivers of mud. The Germans encounter a phenomenon for which they do not even have a word. The Russians call it Rasputitsa. Tanks sink up to their turrets. Trucks get stuck so badly that even tractors cannot pull them out. The pace of the advance drops from 50 kilometers per day to 5, then to 2, and sometimes to just a few hundred meters. Corporal Wilhelm Preuler writes in his diary, "Mud, mud, mud. It is everywhere, in boots, in clothes, in food. Horses collapse from exhaustion. We abandon equipment right on the roads. We cannot evacuate it." This is hell, but a warm hell. We still do not know that the real hell is only beginning. The offensive stalls. Army Group Center gets stuck 100 kilometers from Moscow. The German command decides to wait for the frosts when the ground freezes and movement becomes possible again. They got what they asked for, but were not ready for the consequences. On November 13th, 1941, the temperature drops sharply. Overnight from +5 to -20 degrees. This is only the beginning. The mud turns into stone. Roads become passable again. The German command orders the offensive to resume. On November 15th, tank columns crawl toward Moscow once more. But something goes wrong from the very start. The tanks will not start. Or rather, they start only occasionally. The oil in engines and transmissions has thickened so much that the mechanisms simply cannot turn. To start a tank, crews have to light fires under the hull and warm the engine for an hour, sometimes longer. German soldiers were not prepared for this. Weapons fail, machine guns jam, artillery mechanisms crack from the cold. Trucks refuse to move. Batteries die overnight. But the main problem is not equipment. The main problem is people. A German soldier in November 1941 is dressed in an ordinary coat, thin leather boots, light underwear. He has no felt boots, no padded jackets, no fur hats. Only a steel helmet and a thin cap underneath. At -25 degrees, this is a death sentence. Frostbite begins on a massive scale. Hospitals overflow. Doctors amputate dozens of limbs every day. By the end of November, for every German soldier killed in battle, there are 6 soldiers disabled by frostbite. General Guderian writes to headquarters, "Troops are at their limit. Losses from frostbite exceed combat losses. I demand immediate delivery of winter uniforms." But there are no winter uniforms. They lie in warehouses in Germany and Poland. The railways cannot cope even with ammunition and fuel deliveries. Warm clothing is last on the priority list. By late November, German troops stand just 20 to 30 kilometers from Moscow, in some places even closer. Officers can literally see the Kremlin towers through binoculars, but they cannot move forward. On November 27th, the temperature drops to -38. By early December, to -42, and, in some areas, to -45. Meteorologists record -52 degrees near Volokholamsk. At such temperatures, everything alive freezes. German soldiers huddled in shallow trenches. Digging deeper was impossible. The ground was as hard as concrete. There were no proper shelters, no warm dugouts, no heated barracks. Men slept in tents, ruined houses, or in the backs of trucks. Every night dozens froze to death. In the morning, they were found stiff and lifeless, exactly where they had fallen asleep. Yet the command still demanded one last push. On December 1st, the Germans tried a final assault on Moscow. It failed before it even began. Out of 100 tanks, barely 10 could start. Infantry units were so exhausted and frostbitten that many soldiers couldn't even stand. And at that exact moment, the Red Army launched its counteroffensive. December 5th, 1941. The Red Army launches its decisive counteroffensive. Fresh divisions transferred from Siberia and the Far East strike the frozen German positions with full force. For Soviet soldiers, the cold is brutal as well. But there is one crucial difference. They are prepared for it. They have felt boots, padded jackets, fur hats, and proper winter gear. Their weapons and vehicles are designed to function in extreme temperatures. The T-34 tank starts reliably at -40. The PPPSH submachine gun fires without freezing. Soviet artillery operates normally. The Germans are caught completely off guard. Soviet infantry also has the upper hand. Many of the troops are Siberians, men for whom -40 is simply part of life. They know how to move through deep snow, how to avoid frostbite, how to breathe properly in extreme cold, how to survive in winter trenches. The German army begins to fall back. First, 10 kilometers, then 20. By mid-December, 50, 100, even 150 kilometers from Moscow. This is the first major defeat of the Wehrmacht in World War II. The myth of German invincibility shatters in the frozen fields around Moscow. But what was the real cost of this defeat? From the start of Operation Typhoon in October to the end of December 1941, Army Group Center lost around 100,000 men killed in action. That alone was painful, but not catastrophic for an army of 2 million. The true catastrophe was elsewhere. More than 200,000 German soldiers suffered frostbite. 70,000 of them were severe cases requiring amputations. Another 300,000 were hospitalized with cold-related illnesses, pneumonia, bronchitis, malnutrition, and exhaustion. Many would never return to active duty. Equipment losses were devastating. Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army lost 3/4 of its tanks, not in combat but to the cold. Engines wouldn't start, tracks snapped, armor cracked, transmissions froze solid. By the end of December, some tank divisions had only a handful of operational vehicles left. Artillery units lost up to half their guns. Most were not destroyed in battle. They simply broke down in the extreme cold. The vehicle fleet was nearly wiped out. Thousands of trucks were abandoned on roadsides, frozen and useless. Out of roughly 20,000 vehicles, fewer than 5,000 remained operational by late December. Horses, still the backbone of German logistics, died by the tens of thousands. Without proper shelter or feed, up to 80% of them perished. With horses gone, supply lines collapsed completely.
But the greatest loss was psychological. For the first time, the German soldier understood what real defeat felt like. For the first time, he realized the war would not be over by Christmas, that another winter lay ahead, and another after that. Military doctor Heinrich Harpe wrote in his diary, "I have seen hell, a frozen hell. Men cry like children. Some beg to be sent home. Some shoot themselves because they can't take it anymore." German high command searched desperately for someone to blame. Hitler dismissed commanders, fired generals, reshuffled entire staffs. But the problem wasn't individual leaders. The problem was that Germany had prepared for a short, lightning war, and instead, found itself trapped in a brutal war of attrition it was never ready for. Ironically, winter uniforms had been produced. Millions of coats and boots sat in warehouses. But the rail system was overwhelmed. Ammunition and fuel took priority. Warm clothing came too late. By the time winter gear finally reached the front in January 1942, the damage was already done. Hundreds of thousands of soldiers had already been crippled by frostbite. In a desperate move, the German command issued an order. Soldiers with light frostbite were to remain in service. Only the most severe cases were allowed to leave the front. That meant men with blackened fingers, frozen faces, and damaged feet were forced to keep fighting. And with that, the course of the entire war changed.
The Soviet side suffered enormous losses as well. During the Battle of Moscow, the Red Army lost around 1 million men killed, wounded, or missing. The price was horrific, but it was a defensive war, a fight for survival, and most importantly, it was a victory. Moscow held, and with that, the course of the entire war changed. After the defeat near Moscow, Germany permanently lost strategic initiative on the Eastern Front. Weather affected both sides, of course, but the Soviets were ready to fight in those conditions. Their weapons were designed for Siberian winters. Their soldiers were trained to endure them. Tanker Alexander Fadden later remembered, "Our T-34s started in any frost. We warmed the engine a little, and we were ready to fight. German tanks just stood there like frozen monuments." For many Soviet soldiers, -40 was nothing new. They knew how to dress, how to stay dry, how to keep moving to avoid freezing. Most importantly, they were defending their own land, their homes, their families. That gave them a strength the invaders did not have. Political officer Vasily Kloshkov famously said before his death, "Russia is vast, but there is nowhere to retreat. Behind us is Moscow." Those words became a symbol of the entire battle. German General Gunther Blumentritt later admitted, "We were facing an army superior in endurance and spirit to anything we had ever encountered." Another commander wrote in his diary, "On the day the temperature hit -42, our offensive collapsed. The troops were exhausted physically and morally. Further advance was impossible. Inside Moscow, the city prepared for its last stand. Factories were evacuated east. Museums packed up priceless treasures. Civilians built fortifications. On November 7, 1941, with the enemy only 100 kilometers away, a military parade was held on Red Square. From that parade, soldiers marched directly to the front. It was a powerful message. Moscow would not surrender. Ordinary Muscovites worked around the clock. Teenagers and women replaced men at factory machines. People dug anti-tank trenches, built barricades, extinguished fires from air raids. Food was scarce. Heating barely worked. But morale held firm. Everyone understood. The fate of the country was being decided just outside the city. Meanwhile, German soldiers wrote desperate letters home. One corporal wrote to his wife, "The cold here is beyond imagination. I can't feel my legs anymore. I'm afraid to take off my boots. I might lose my toes." Another diary entry read, "We can see Moscow, but we will never reach it. We are all going to die here." When the Red Army attacked, the German retreat turned into chaos. Weapons, vehicles, and equipment were abandoned. Columns clogged the roads. Soviet aircraft bombed them from above. Partisans attacked from the forests. The once proud Wehrmacht was now simply trying to survive. By the end of December, German forces had been pushed 100 to 200 kilometers away from Moscow. The immediate threat to the capital was gone, but the battle continued into the spring of 1942. It was one of the bloodiest campaigns of the early war, and a turning point in world history. So why did Germany lose at Moscow? First, they underestimated the Soviet Union. Second, they were completely unprepared for the climate. Third, distances were far greater than their logistics could handle. Fourth, Soviet resistance was far stronger than expected. And finally, disastrous strategic miscalculations by Hitler himself. For the Soviet Union, the victory near Moscow had enormous significance. First, the capital, the political, economic, and cultural heart of the country, was saved. Second, Germany's plan for a quick war collapsed completely. Instead of a short campaign, they now faced a long, exhausting conflict they were not prepared to fight. Third, the victory raised the morale of the Soviet people and the Red Army. It proved that the enemy was not invincible. For the rest of the world, Moscow became a symbol. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill declared, "Russia has saved civilization. The stand at Moscow has shown that the spirit of freedom is alive. The German war machine has been stopped for the first time." U.S. President Franklin Roosevelt sent a message to Stalin congratulating the Soviet people on their great victory. After the war, many German generals tried to explain the defeat simply by blaming the weather. "If it hadn't been for the frost, we would have taken Moscow," they said. But that was only an excuse. Yes, the cold played a role. But the real reason was that Soviet soldiers fought better, were better prepared for winter, and were defending their homeland. German historian Paul Carrel later wrote, "The defeat at Moscow was not caused by frost alone. It was the result of underestimating the enemy, strategic mistakes, supply problems, and the extraordinary fighting spirit of the Soviet troops. The cold only made everything worse." When we remember the Battle of Moscow today, it is important to understand this was not just a military operation. It was a clash of two ideologies, two systems, two worlds. Fascism came to Russia with a sword and received a resistance it never expected. 1 million German soldiers near Moscow truly froze. Not all of them died from the cold directly, but as a fighting force, they were frozen solid. Their equipment stopped. Their weapons failed. Their will collapsed. They turned from a victorious army into a freezing, starving, demoralized mass of men whose only goal was to survive another day. Meanwhile, Soviet soldiers in the same conditions found the strength not only to hold the line, but to push the enemy back and deliver the first major defeat of Nazi Germany. This is a lesson for all times. Military power is not just tanks and airplanes. It is the ability to adapt to any conditions, to know your land, to endure hardship, and to have an unbreakable will to win. The Battle of Moscow showed the world that Blitzkrieg had failed. The Soviet Union would not fall in a few weeks. A long and terrible war lay ahead. A war that would end not with a German parade in Moscow, but with Soviet soldiers storming Berlin. Minus 42 degrees, 30 kilometers from Moscow. This is more than a line in a weather report. It became a symbol that there are forces even the most powerful military machine cannot defeat, and a symbol that defending your homeland gives people the strength to endure the unbearable. Let us remember the heroes of that battle, the soldiers who stopped German tanks at Dubosakovo, the defenders of the Volokholamsk Highway, the pilots who rammed enemy planes, the partisans who blew up trains behind enemy lines. Let us remember the ordinary men who stood to the death in the trenches near Moscow, the citizens who built fortifications, worked in factories, and fought fires during air raids, the women and teenagers who kept the city alive, while their fathers and brothers fought at the front. Their sacrifice is our history, our memory, and our pride. Thank you for being with us today. If this story moved you, share it with your friends and family. Subscribe to our channel to discover more incredible and important stories from the past. Remember, history teaches us to avoid repeating the mistakes of yesterday, to value peace, and to honor those who gave their lives for our freedom. Until next time, friends.